Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
The UN urges swift action to prevent impending disaster in the besieged Gaza Strip. Iran hails the summit of the non-aligned movement as a diplomatic coup against the West. And U.S. arms sales reach record high as Gulf states stock up. Mosaic World News from the Middle East begins now.
Officials at the United Nations warned that the Gaza Strip will face an impending humanitarian crisis by 2020 if the world fails to intervene to solve the situation. The humanitarian coordinator for the occupied Palestinian territory, Maxwell Gaylord, said that Gaza will face an impending crisis in all sectors if the siege is not lifted.
الدراسة استغرق إعدادها 8 أشهر وأشرف عليها فريق متخصص من الأمم المتحدة.
After 8 months of work, a specialized team from the United Nations released worrisome figures pointing to the Gaza Strip's population growth alongside problems in water, sanitation, health, and education.
في القطاع إضافة إلى ارتفاع نسب الفقر والبطالة.
In addition, the report indicated poverty and unemployment are rising, describing the situation as catastrophic.
بحلول عام 2020 نسبة سكان القطاع ستكون قد
By 2020, Gaza's population will have increased by about 500,000 individuals, which means an additional 500,000 people in need of food, shelter, education, and employment. As of today, there is a shortage in clean water, electricity, schools, jobs, and services in the Strip.
نداء الاستغاثة الذي أطلقه المسؤولون هنا دعا دول العالم كافة إلى تحمل مسؤولياتها إزاء ما يجري في قطاع.
The cry for help issued by the officials here calls on all nations to bear their responsibilities in the face of what is happening in Gaza, considering that the slow economic growth, in addition to the increasing population, will result in a surge of the burden carried by the refugee agency in the fields of health, education, relief, and employment.
Just to bring us closer to current WHO standards.
يجب إضافة 5 مراكز صحية.
5 new medical centers, 220 doctors, and over 300 medical experts must be added. Right now, we have 1 doctor for every 100 patients on a daily basis.
بحلول العام 2016 مصادر المياه الشرب قد تكون.
By 2016, potable water sources could dwindle and no longer be salvaged, so they will be unusable by 2020.
ويشير التقرير إلى أن احتياجات القطاع للمياه.
The report indicates that the Strip's needs for fresh water, homes, educational and medical centers, and job opportunities will increase by almost 30%.
تصل إلى 30%، وهو رقم خطير في ظل.
A dangerous number in light of the sharp decrease in revenue and international aid that is needed to meet these necessities.
هذه الاحتياجات. ويشير التقرير أيضا إلى أن الفلسطينيين في غزة بحاجة.
The report also points out that Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are in need of peace, security, and an end to the siege and isolation, in addition to encouragement and support to be able to confront the upcoming challenges. Shukri Al-Kashif, BBC, the Gaza Strip.
Cairo court sentenced 1 man to 5 years in prison in connection with last year's attack on the Israeli and Saudi embassies. 75 other people were given 1-year suspended sentences. Ironically, Omar Afifi, the only person who received a jail sentence, fled Egypt and was tried in absentia. Protesters stormed the Israeli embassy in Cairo in September following the killing of 5 Egyptian security guards who were caught in a crossfire between the IDF and a gang of terrorists who had ambushed and killed 8 Israelis along the Sinai border. Some of the protesters also stoned the Saudi embassy.
The IDF military advocate general has reportedly recommended to launch a criminal investigation into former Chief of Staff Gabi Ashkenazi and his former aide Colonel Erez Wiener on counts of misconduct during Ashkenazi's term as head of the IDF. The recommendation has been brought to Attorney General Yehuda Weinstein, who has to decide on the matter due to the fact that Ashkenazi is now a civilian. It's known as the Harpaz Affair, and it continues to plague former IDF Chief Gabi Ashkenazi and impact appointments in the IDF echelon to this day. The suspicions are that in 2010, as IDF commander, Ashkenazi used Boaz Harpaz, a retired lieutenant colonel, to collect incriminating information on Major General Yoav Gallant to torpedo his possible appointment as his successor as Chief of General Staff. Defense Minister Ehud Barak wanted Gallant. Ashkenazi did not. Ironically, in the end, Gallant's appointment was rescinded due to irregularities in his personal life that came to light. Military Advocate General Danny Efroni has reportedly sent a letter to State Attorney General Yehuda Weinstein saying there was prima facie evidence that Ashkenazi and his aide, Colonel Erez Weiner, had committed fraud and breach of trust. Colonel Weiner was also suspected of behavior unbecoming of an officer. Efroni was apparently relying on an investigation by the State Comptroller, Michael Lindenstrauss, which has not yet been made public. It is now up to the Attorney General, Yehuda Weinstein, to accept the recommendations of the State Comptroller, and now the Advocate General, to order police to open an investigation. Ashkenazi's spokesman, Itai Ben-Harin, said he had no knowledge of the Advocate General's recommendations, and it sounded puzzling. The IDF spokesman's office said that Efroni did not order a criminal investigation, but they did acknowledge that the Advocate General and the Justice Ministry were considering further action in the Harpaz affair. They added that they had no comment to make regarding internal professional deliberations in the Army before they are finalized. The report comes a few days after IDF Chief Benny Gantz announced that Weiner will not be promoted to Chief IDF Education Officer due to the ongoing investigation. In any case, the whole affair has put a black mark on the former IDF chief, and some say has damaged the public confidence in the IDF leadership.
Israel has refused entry to dozens of extreme left-wing pro-Palestinian agitators who attempted to cross into the West Bank from Jordan by way of the Allenby Bridge. The IDF stamped rejected in the passports of the protesters, who said they wanted to travel to Bethlehem as part of a Welcome to Palestine campaign. The so-called Flytilla campaign was foiled by Israel last April when several thousand activists were blocked from leaving European airports. Others who made it to Ben Gurion Airport were deported after being denied entry.
They reject us because we openly say that we are in solidarity with Palestinians, and because they don't want any witness to see what they are doing to Palestinians.
Staying in the region, and Turkish police used tear gas and water cannons to disperse a group of Kurdish demonstrators who tried to stage a rally in support of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, in southeastern Turkey. Kurds took to the streets after Turkish authorities refused to give them a permit for the demonstration. They fought the police by hurling rocks and bottles. Kurds have been struggling for nearly 3 decades for their own autonomous region in southeastern Turkey, where they are the majority. The conflict has claimed more than 40,000 lives.
تتواصل التحضيرات لقمة دول عدم الانحياز السادسة عشرة.
In Tehran, where the 16th summit of non-aligned nations is held, expert-level meetings are concluding tonight after agreeing to a closing draft document. A positive atmosphere and cooperation reigned between the participating delegates, who will present the draft at the foreign ministers' meeting, which begins tomorrow and will be held for 2 consecutive days.
The first phase of the expert-level meetings at the 16th Summit of the Nations of the Non-Aligned Movement witnessed intense negotiations on both political and economic fronts impacting the member states. It aimed to reach an agreeable tone to the final draft declaration, which will be issued by the summit's presidency. Then, it will be presented on Tuesday and Wednesday to the ministerial-level summit.
The importance of gathering top experts is that all the summit's documents presented here in a specialized manner can be scrutinized, analyzed, and strengthened. If sections need to be added or subtracted, the issue is discussed, then the findings of their work is presented to the meeting of foreign ministers.
The summit is held under the theme, Lasting Peace Through Joint Global Governance, that Tehran hopes to push into a global discussion over the next 3 years, and to which the participating delegates responded with enthusiasm.
I think the theme or subject of governance and permanent peace through the joint international administration is truly a good slogan, a great one. In reality, the world today is lacking many of these joint efforts, which, under these conditions, ought to be able to promote peace, to fulfill peace, and for the international community to bear its responsibilities.
The second day's meetings, which will officially be limited to an evening session, were set aside for an economic and social document that will be produced by the conference. The final document consists of 3 chapters and 688 clauses, covering international, regional, and development-related issues impacting the member states.
In the 3-year period of the presidency of the non-aligned movement that will be held in the Islamic Republic, we will present projects and initiatives to elevate the level of economic cooperation between member states in an effective way. Organizers are saying that the average number of participating states and the level of dignitaries at the Tehran summit is larger than any of the 15 previous summits. It's noticeable through the movement of high-level foreign dignitaries in the capital. They are here to participate in various meetings and to hold talks on the sideline about various issues that impact member states, and they hail from the world's different continents, from Asia to Africa and Latin America. There is a noticeable presence of the issue of Palestine, Syria, and the Islamic awakening.
The summit's expert-level meeting witnessed an atmosphere of agreement and consensus over the clauses of the final draft document that will be issued by the presidency of the movement. The positive atmosphere that prevailed between the dignitaries and the Iranian host reflect hopes for a future of communal cooperation between the nations of the non-aligned movement. Riyad Al-Akhras, Al-Alam, Tehran.
We're going to begin with news from Afghanistan, in which another Afghan soldier has turned his weapon on U.S.-led troops. This time, 2 American soldiers have been killed in Lagman province. And so far this year, more than 40 foreign troops have been killed across that country in what has been called the so-called green-on-blue attacks. Our correspondent from Kabul, Faiz Khurshid, has more.
Growing green-on-blue attacks in Afghanistan. On Monday, 2 more U.S. soldiers were killed in eastern Lagman province, yet again by an Afghan soldier. He was identified as Walayat Khan. American and Afghan soldiers were busy checking cars in a checkpoint when Khan pulled out his gun and turned it on U.S. troops, killing 2 of them. He himself was also shot dead in return fire. To this U.S. military man, it's a new tactic of the militants.
That's all it is. It's a new tactic in which they are trying to render some effects.
But there is not only one reason.
We found out was that most of those cases were not insurgent linked. They were clearly personal grievances or stress situations or battle fatigue.
These 2 deaths have brought the overall number of green-on-blue attacks to 42 this year so far. It's a sharp increase from last year. About 31 troops were killed during the whole 2011 in such attacks. 24 of them were American. It's a disturbing development for the U.S. military here. Green-on-blue attacks have also further strained the relations between Kabul and Washington. In his recent trip to Kabul, Martin Dempsey, the U.S. top officer, has pushed President Karzai to tackle this challenge immediately. And right after his visit, Karzai ordered to revise Afghan military recruitment process.
We are going to change the recruitment of people as policemen and soldiers to avoid these attacks.
Attacks on NATO forces by their Afghan colleagues have jumped when the copies of Holy Quran were burnt in Bagram air base by a group of American soldiers. It has angered Afghans very much. Afghan forces killed 6 American soldiers at that time, and since then, all what foreign troops want is to have very limited contacts with Afghan forces. Americans now give military trainings to Afghans, even with toy weapons, a sign of growing mistrust. So green-on-blue attacks have greatly damaged the trust between foreign troops and Afghans. And this low level of trust has prompted U.S. generals to order all U.S.-led forces here to carry fully loaded magazines in their weapons, even inside their bases, in response to these shootings. They're also now spying on Afghan forces to identify potential attackers. Faiz Khurshid, Press TV, Kabul.
A new study shows U.S. arms sales for the year 2011 tripled to a record high as Persian Gulf Arab states increased their weapons stockpiles. Thanks to demand from Persian Gulf Arab states, the U.S. sold a whopping $66.3 billion of arms last year. Believe it or not, America's weapons sales were a little over $21 billion just a year earlier. But last year's sales to just Saudi Arabia were at $33 billion. Another major buyer of U.S. weaponry is the United Arab Emirates. Activists have repeatedly voiced concern about the sales of arms to Persian Gulf Arab states because some of those weapons are used against pro-democracy protesters.
The images of massacres are moving from one Syrian city to the next, carrying with them a tragedy for every home. The neighborhoods of Damascus, whose countryside bid farewell to the victims of the Doroya massacre, were a specific target for the regime's warplanes and tanks today. The Free Syrian Army said it downed a Syrian army airplane over the area of Al-Kaboun in Damascus, as confirmed by official Syrian television. The shelling in the capital was concentrated on the neighborhood of Jobar and was accompanied by a large deployment of security and army forces ahead of plans to storm the southern neighborhoods, including Al-Qadam and Asali. In the neighborhood of Damascus, the shelling was renewed with heavy weapons targeting the cities of Harasta, Amareya, Sakba, and Arbin. Last night in the city of Busra al-Sham in Daraa province, a massacre took place, claiming the lives of nearly 73 people, most of them women and children, according to pictures uploaded by activists that showed very harsh images. Activists said the massacre was the result of the regime forces' rocket shelling that hit residential buildings. Regime forces stormed the city of Ankil and the town Nafa with tanks amid heavy gunfire. And in northern Syria, regime airplanes and tanks shelled several neighborhoods in Aleppo. Since the morning, the target was the area of Souk al-Hail in Aleppo, which led to dozens of injuries. This came as clashes between Syrian regime forces and opposition fighters continued in Reer Hayya. In Idlib province, the town of Al-Haybayt was subjected to violent shelling by regime forces with heavy artillery. The areas of Homs al-Qadima were also a target of the shelling amid a siege. As for the north, military operations continued in the city of Deir ez-Zor and also in its countryside. The daily shelling turned Marah in the countryside of Aleppo into a ghost town. Most residents evacuated the city in search of a haven after their homes turned into rubble, with the exception of a minority that had no other choice but to stay, as clashes are intensifying in the surrounding area. The city today holds the largest prison run by the opposition's brigades. In addition, it's the center of the attacks against the Syrian army, placing the civilians' lives in constant danger. The gates of the Turkish-Syrian border crossing remain closed to Syrian refugees who are searching for refuge. Thousands of Syrian refugees fleeing the violence in their towns have been stranded on the Syrian side of the border leading to Hatay province in southern Turkey since last night, after they were prevented from entering the country. A Turkish official who refused to identify himself said his country is no longer capable of taking in the increasing number of Syrian refugees, adding that Turkey is working on establishing new areas for the refugees. A source assured that Turkish authorities are offering food and humanitarian aid to Syrian refugees stranded on the border through the barbed wire fence, as Ankara had announced that it's not able to host more than 100,000 refugees on its territory.
The last decade witnessed an increase in growth for a number of countries on both the economic and political fronts, which is a matter that irritates a number of Americans who see this as a threat to the American hegemony and a competition over the title, the largest power in the world.
The two American presidential candidates, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, are trying to win the trust of the American voter, and each one of them is trying to convince them that they are better at preserving the American leadership of the world.
Politics and economics are inseparable in America when it comes to leadership, and to preserving its leading role, Washington has finally turned its vision from Europe, that's burdened with debt, and opened its doors to Asian and Pacific countries with partnerships that Barack Obama strove to intensify this year.
We are beginning to see the emergence.
We are beginning
to see the emergence of China, India, Brazil, Turkey, and Russia, which will result in multipolarity after a while. Right now, there is an economic challenge, and China may be a political power in a decade. And history has taught us that an economic power becomes a military power.
American voters seek to choose the better candidate to limit this competition.
He says things like Russia.
Romney says things like, Russia is America's #1 geopolitical foe, which is a saying that strays from reality. Therefore, I think Obama is in a better place because Romney did not demonstrate that he is the man of the changing world.
History rules in favor of the Democrats, especially at reducing the unemployment rate and providing jobs for Americans. This is a chronic problem because many American companies outsource jobs to China to reduce their costs. And according to Bloomberg agency, Democrats ruled the White House 23 years out of the past 5 decades, in which they created 42 million jobs for Americans. As for Republicans, they ruled for 27 years, during which they created nearly 21 million jobs. Observers see that the choice based on the economy is not difficult between the two candidates. The partisan ideologies remain the voting compass for reaching a wider segment of Americans. The hero of employment and enemy of unemployment, he's President Bill Clinton, according to Bloomberg statistics that revealed that not only did he turn the budget deficit that he inherited from George H.W. Bush to a surplus, but he also created jobs for Americans that's equivalent to what the Republican presidents created over 27 years. So, will Americans vote based on figures or partisan fanaticism? Wajd Waqfi, Al Jazeera, Washington.
The breakdown in morale and the outbreak of psychological and neurological disorders that have affected American troops have now reached the British Armed Forces. The British Army is experiencing a sharp decline in morale troops as a result of the wars and a reduction in defense spending.
It is now clear that what the United States and Britain thought would be a picnic for their soldiers at war against Iraq and Afghanistan is a quagmire that will continue to chase them even after they withdraw in defeat. The 11 years of war on Iraq and Afghanistan drained the military forces of both countries that lost their best soldiers after their souls and spirits were destroyed. The American and British armies seem psychologically exhausted and defeated, as confirmed by the latest survey by Sky News, revealing a sharp decline in the morale of British armed forces. The survey showed that the number of British soldiers suffering from low morale in all 3 services, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, has recently increased from 33% to 50%. In addition, British soldiers demonstrated a drastic increase in low morale, with a rise of 21 points to 45%. The study revealed that the Army is bearing the biggest brunt and will lose 20,000 soldiers by 2020 as a result of reforms and cuts recently announced by the British Defence Ministry to reduce a budget deficit of 38 billion British pounds, or $60 billion.
لسد العجز البالغ
63% of British Army officers complained of declining morale due to layoffs as they lose hope of being promoted. This sharp decline in the spirits of the British forces was preceded by that of the American Army. The number of U.S. soldiers committing suicide has risen, while psychological and neurological disorders and permanent physical disabilities are rampant. The deterioration of American and British forces, in addition to the economic collapse caused by 11 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, has left the U.S. and its followers unable to wage any new war directly. This has led them to mobilize mercenary terrorists and Wahhabis to wage their wars.
The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible by grants from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Wincote Foundation, the Firedoll Foundation, and by support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news, read our blog, get transcripts of past shows, and more at linktv.org/mosaic. Airwaves, a global channel of uncompromising stories, world news, documentaries, entertainment, and culture. Link TV, connecting you to the world. For more information, visit linktv.org.